The Depression and World War II generation of Americans is called the greatest generation. They trudged through the Great Depression and then fought their way to victory in World War II. After the war, they came home and got to work building this country, and their success then was measured by working in the same job for 35 or 40 years and retiring with a pension and a gold watch. So tracking their lives is fairly easy. They typically made one move, bought one, maybe two houses in the same town where they spent their entire adult lives, many times their entire lives. The families that moved from town to town, job to job, were out there in America, but not in the same numbers, and fair or not, were not looked upon very well. They weren't seen as stable, reliable, because they didn't stick around. Now this began to change as the baby boomer generation started the trend of changing jobs as a career advancement. For the next generations, staying at one company for 3 to 4 years is the norm instead of 30 to 40. Now that's a very broad strokes view of American culture to set the stage for our continued study of the life of Paul, proof of his apostleship. Since Paul was current before current was cool, immediately after his conversion, he began preaching, which led to a pattern of moving every few years. His career could remain the same, preaching the gospel, but he didn't follow the regular pattern of getting married, buying a home, and staying in one place until retirement. And since that's the pattern today, Paul was current before current was cool. Now we're going to see this trend unfold today in a lesson we'll call From Antioch to Asia Minor, the life of Paul, proof of his apostleship from Antioch to Asia Minor. And this is going to be primarily from Acts chapters 11 through 14 because that's the record, the predominant record of that time frame of his life. Now I want you to remember, this study is a study of the book of Galatians, the gospel letter as I call it, or Galatians, the singular gospel. And we divided the book into three sections, three primary sections. One is a singular source. That's chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 14. Singular message is the second section, and this is chapter 2, verse 15, through chapter 4, verse 31. So basically through the end of chapter 4. And then the third section is singular walk. It's the way of life, and it's in the Spirit, and that's chapters 5 and 6. Now, we've been working our way through the first section of the book, the singular source. And we've been doing that and doing so, we've been seeing how Paul has had to defend himself and his apostleship. In fact, he wrote this letter to the Galatians as a response to false teachers who were undermining him and his authority, and by extension, the gospel that he was teaching. They were attacking the very message and the messenger, and Paul had to defend both. In fact, at the beginning of the letter, at the very start of the Galatian letter in Galatians chapter 1, he began with a serious rebuke of the brethren there in those Galatian churches for following and believing this false doctrine. Notice in chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. This is Galatians chapter 1. This is Paul's rebuke of these people, because they were following a false message. These false teachers were leading these disciples off into following a false message that really wasn't even a gospel. They couldn't call it a gospel because it's not. It's not good news, it's bad news. Look at chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. So they're taking the message of salvation in Christ and twisting it, perverting it. And so notice what Paul does in verses 8 and 9. He downs on their damnation for this false doctrine. Verse 8, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed or to be condemned, marked out for the destruction of God, for the damnation of God. And that's a very strong word, but that's what he's doing here. That's what he's saying about them. The Judaizers, those are the people who said that Gentiles had to live like Jews, and they were teaching that in order to be a Christian, the Gentiles had to become Jews, subject to and living under the law of Moses. So Paul pronounced double damnation on anyone teaching such a doctrine because it steals people out of Christ. It's not a gospel. It's not good news. It's not a gospel message because it's bad news. It's soul-destroying news. Think about that for a moment. When we look at false doctrine that's taught today through the lens of destroyed souls, we must become unwilling to compromise or overlook it. I want to think about that. If we would look at false doctrine through the lens of Paul and say, this steals people's souls, it distorts the gospel and steals people away from God. Notice back in chapter 1, verse 6, that when the people follow this doctrine, they're deserting God. And so if we looked at the gospels and messages that are being taught in the world today that are false, and the people that follow it, they're being pulled away from Christ, not toward Christ. No matter what they may claim, they're being pulled away from Christ. And that should make us very serious about standing against it. In our world, the greatest, most predominant false doctrine here in America is the perversion called Calvinism. It teaches that saying obedience to the gospel is necessary for salvation is the moral equivalent of the Judaizers condemned here by Paul. So when you read in the New Testament, it says, repent and be baptized for the remission of sins. And if I tell someone that, some Calvinists step up and say, oh, that's like the Judaizers. No, that is a false equivalence. Their doctrine, that doctrine of Calvinism, is just as cursed as the Judaizing teaching of Paul's day that he was fighting. Now, admittedly, here in America, but especially in Europe and across the Western world, it has stiff competition from the false doctrine of Catholicism. But those two doctrines are competing with each other to steal people away from God and make them followers of those teachers and those doctrines. Well, let's go back to Paul and his duty to prove his apostleship. He's already shown in his pre-conversion life and conversion itself as evidence that God was the source of his authority and message. Despite hearing multiple defenses of Jesus as the Messiah when he was persecuting the church, Paul didn't believe them. And then Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, and suddenly he was convinced that Jesus of Nazareth was the Christ. And so he went to Damascus and waited 3 days, didn't eat or drink, waiting 3 days for somebody to come tell him what to do. Well, Jesus sent Ananias to him and told him, here's what you need to do to be saved. Be baptized. And so he was baptized. And here's the work that you have to do. You're going to be called, Jesus has called you to go preach. And so last time, in our last study previously, we looked at that first decade or so. And I'll admit that the timing here is unclear because the Bible just doesn't really make it a priority. God didn't think it was all that important for us to know the specific dates. So we have to fill in some blanks and come up with some reasonable dates for the time frame that these things are taking place. And so it's reasonable, I thought, that this happened around 35 AD, approximately 2 years after the death of Christ, is when Paul is converted. And then he spent 3 years in Damascus and Arabia without any contact with any apostles. He didn't get his message from them. He finally met Peter in Jerusalem, but that was only for about 15 days. He was only in Jerusalem for 15 days, and he didn't spend all his time with Peter because he was out preaching and stirring up strife by his gospel message and causing people to want to kill him. And so Jesus sent him home, said, get out of here, and the brethren sent him home to Taurus. All of that's back in Galatians chapter 1, Acts chapter 9, or Acts chapters 9, 22, and 26. What's the main point? The main point is that no man or men, not even the apostles, were the source of Paul's authority and message. He had a singular source. It was God. Now today, as we begin looking at from Antioch to Asia Minor, we find more proof that the singular source for Paul was God. Now, we ended last time, Paul was away in Tarsus at home. That was his home area. That's where he was sent. Now, what he did there and how long he was there is unclear. It's thought that it's around 7 to 10 years that he was there. from about AD 37 to 45. Well, how do we know this? How do we get that 7 to 10 years? And that's a very good question. It's a fair question. Well, we have to start with the date of the Jerusalem conference in Acts chapter 15 and work backwards. And it's considered pretty confidently that AD 49 was when that Jerusalem conference took place. That's pretty solid scholarly effort has determined and says that that's the most likely date for the conference. Now, some people will say a different date by a year or two, but most come down to it being somewhere right at 49 AD. Well, then you start working backwards. Before that, he was in Antioch for a while. We don't know how long. I'll talk about that in a moment. But in 47 and 48, he was off on his first missionary tour. Now, that may have been 46 to 48. We're not really sure exactly how long that was, but it's thought to be approximately 2 years that he was off preaching and teaching in the island of Cyprus and then over into up into Asia Minor. And he was there for a couple of years. Then we work back, so that's 47 to 48. And then we work backwards, 45 to 46. He's in Antioch for a year, the text tells us, in Antioch. And then he was away in Tarsus from 37 to 45. And we know that that would have been about 37 because from 35 to 37, so for that 3-year period, he was in Arabia and Damascus. All right, so you see how we get that time frame. Now, again, it's possible, or it's impossible to say that these are the only dates that we can consider, that there's no other possibility for the time frame, but this is a good, solid, reasonable option. This is pretty close. Even if it's not exactly the time frame, even if I'm off a year or two here or there, it's still pretty close to the time frame of how we get to that 7 to 10 years that Paul was away in the city of Tarsus. So there's just kind of a period of 7 years or so where we just don't know what's going on with Paul. In fact, that's kind of the next thought that we want to talk about, his post-conversion life in Syria and Cilicia. What's he going and doing? What's going on? What do we know about those years? Well, honestly, next to nothing. Now, we do know he probably did some preaching and teaching in the synagogues and did some traveling, because in 2 Corinthians, in chapter 11, verses 24 through 25, we read this: 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I've spent in the deep. That's in 2 Corinthians 11, 24 and 25. Now, Paul wrote that letter to the Corinthian church in about 56 AD, so it's about 7 years after the Jerusalem conference. And so about 7 or 8 years after that first missionary tour. And I want you to think about it. Think about this. He records, when he says 5 times the whippings by the Jews, that's 39 lashes. That's not recorded anywhere in the book of Acts. This is the only place where we read about that, and it happened prior to AD 56. So, beginning in AD 47, the book of Acts is basically about the life of Paul. He's the primary character, and so it would seem reasonable that if those 39 lashes, those 5 times of receiving those whippings, would have been recorded in the book of Acts, but they're not. So it's very likely those happened in that period of time that we don't know anything about. Again, we don't know for certain because God didn't choose to reveal that to us, other than through Paul here that it had happened. The 2 beatings, we read about one of them in the second missionary journey that happened about 3 or 4 years before he wrote this letter, or about 4 years before he wrote the letter. So we read about that beating that took place in Philippi. The stoning, well, that happened in Lystra on the first journey back in around 47, 48 AD. The 3 shipwrecks, don't know when or where those happened because those were not recorded anywhere in Acts, because the one shipwreck that we know about in Acts chapter 27 occurred 4 or 5 years after he wrote this. So you see the idea that this is something that there were things that were going on in the life of Paul that God just did not think that we needed to know in any explicit detail. Now, I want you to pause right here for a moment. Pause with me and let's think for a moment. Let that sink in. Let that verse, I want you to look at that verse, and I want you to let that sink in. What does that tell you? 5 whippings, 3 beatings, 3 shipwrecks, including the one that he received later, a stoning. If we needed any evidence that Paul got his message directly from God, this is it. That's it. He knew the source of his message, and no human source message. If he'd gotten this from men, there's no way, and didn't really believe it was from God, there's no way he would have put up with that. There's no way he would have continued plugging along through that, like the greatest generation had the hope of winning the world, getting through the Great Depression and winning World War II. Paul had a hope that reached even beyond that. And that's the only thing that would keep him going through that kind of abuse and that kind of mistreatment. That's proof that his message was from God, and his authority was from God. Singular source. Now we're going to talk about the significance of that at the end of the study, but let's keep going. The next thing is, we do know a little bit more about it, and in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 10, we won't take the time to read it, but just got a note about it here on the screen, or on the monitor. He received great heavenly visions about 14 years before he wrote this in 2 Corinthians. That would put it squarely back at the time that he was away in Tarsus, before he went to Antioch and began preaching there. So that gives us an idea of the fact that Paul really has to have received his message from God, because that was the only thing that would give him the courage to keep preaching and teaching. Think about it with the 12 apostles. Same thing for them. When Jesus died, they were done. It was like, we're done. It's over. What are we going to do? There's nothing to do. And then all of a sudden, 3 days later, they saw the risen Christ, and now they're energized and they're ready to go preach and teach. Why? Because they saw the resurrected Christ. Why is Paul energized to go preach and teach? Because he saw the risen Christ and received message and authority directly from God. Now, going back to this life of Paul post-conversion, other than these little mentions here that we don't really know specifically when and where they happened, we just don't know much about that. But we do know that we finally hear about Paul again. And when Barnabas goes to Antioch, the Christians are up in Antioch, the Christian Jews are up in Antioch, they're preaching the gospel to the Jews, and then they began preaching to the Gentiles. Peter had that experience in Acts chapter 10 and 11 where God said, go preach to the Gentiles. He went and he preached. They were baptized and saved, and so he had to go back to Jerusalem and explain himself. And so the gospel now is going outside of the Jews. And so when there's a church in Antioch that begins preaching to Gentiles, Gentiles are being saved, the church and the elders and the apostles hear about it back in Jerusalem and say, we got to find out what's going on. So they send Barnabas up there. Again, we don't know the specific dates, but we figure that sometime around 45 AD, 44, 45, probably 45. They send him up there to Jerusalem, or to Antioch. Barnabas gets up there and he says, you know what? I know just the guy to do this work up here, Paul. And so he goes to Tarsus and he calls Paul to Antioch. He brings him down there. It says in Acts chapter 11, verse 25 and 26, he left for Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he had found him. So that means that Paul's kind of off there by themselves. And this kind of ties into this important point about Paul's not getting his apostleship and his message from men, and not even from the apostles, because they don't even really know where he is. He's off there, whatever he's doing. The apostles and the church in Jerusalem is not involved in it. So he brought him to Antioch, and for an entire year they met with the church and taught considerable numbers, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. And so here's the source. This is the first time Christians, the name Christian, surfaces in the Bible, a name that I proudly wear, and I hope that you proudly wear as well, because that's what we are, Christians, if we're believers and faithful believers in Christ. So he went up to collect them, and they preached there for a year, and they had great success. Well, then in AD 46 and 47, he got sent down to Jerusalem with some alms. Some prophets rose up and said, hey, there's going to be a famine in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is going to need some help, and so the church in Antioch took up a collection to send down there. The Gentile Christians wanted to establish a connection and a fellowship with the church down in the Jewish church in Jerusalem, and so they sent funds down there. It says in verse 25 and 26, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea, and they did according to their means, and this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. And I want you to notice that point there about the elders. They sent it to the elders. The apostles are not mentioned. Now where they are, what they're doing, we don't know. We see them again in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, but right now, when Paul and Barnabas go down there, they don't connect to the apostles. They go to the elders. Now, if you go back into the book of Acts and you read chapter 12, chapter 11, you see the apostles sitting down there. Chapter 12 is kind of an interlude, which is kind of a look back to what had happened in Acts chapter and earlier when Herod had tried to, the grandson of Herod the Great, had tried to kill Peter. He had killed James, the brother of John, and arrested Peter and was going to kill him, and Peter was rescued. God wasn't through with him yet. He had work to do yet. And then Herod died shortly thereafter, but that was in 44 AD. Again, it gives you a specific date. We know that in 44 AD that Herod died, and there's a record of that actually in Acts chapter 12. Now, what does that tell us? That we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that that's when Paul and Barnabas were in Jerusalem. It was likely a couple of years later, after that they came down there. So we know that that's when they came down there. So again, the idea here is that Paul and Barnabas weren't in Jerusalem when that happened, when this persecution happened. And it seems like the apostles scattered for a little while and were in hiding. And so again, he didn't have any contact with them. That's the point. Paul had no contact with the elders, with the apostles. That's the idea. He's not getting his authority from the apostles. There's no reference to them at all. And that would explain why it's not even mentioned in Galatians. Paul in his Galatian letter doesn't even bother to say anything about that trip, because he didn't meet any apostles. All right, that makes it easy for us to know he wasn't there when all this persecution was happening, and he had no contact with the apostles when he went. Because remember, his point in Galatians is to confirm that he didn't get his authority from the apostles. Another thing too is that Acts was written 10 years after Galatians, about 10 years, maybe a little more. So, and it was never intended to fill in the blanks, to give us a detailed itinerary of all the apostles. That was never the intention. It was about Christ and the spread of the gospel and the confirmation of the gospel. That's really what it was about. Well, let's continue on, and just again with Paul's post-conversion life here, showing us that he didn't get his message and his authority from the apostles, because he went on a missionary tour in Acts chapters 13 and 14. His first missionary tour covered from approximately 47 and 48 AD. And here again, Paul begins to establish his pattern of moving from place to place. This is when he was current before it was, he was cool before it was current, or he was current before it was cool to not move and to stay somewhere. He was moving from place to place, still preaching the gospel, but not staying in one place for very long. But again, the point for us is not that Paul was moving and he fits in with the current generation here in America. The point is, in connection to establishing his authority and message, did not come from man. See, the point is, there weren't any apostles in Cyprus with him. There weren't any apostles in Asia Minor and Antioch and Derbe and Lystra and Iconium, where he was preaching and he was stoned. I guarantee you there were no other apostles with him when we got stoned in Lystra. They just weren't there. We don't really know where they were because they're not talked about, and so it's really kind of irrelevant. But the point is, they weren't traveling with Paul. Paul got his message from God. And then finally we see they got back to Antioch, and they were there for a long time in Acts 14, verse 28. How long is a long time? I don't know. The Bible isn't clear. It could have been as much as a year, maybe even more, which could push the chronology back just a little bit, but that's okay. That's why there's room for movement on those dates, and I'm not going to be adamant that you have to accept these dates as the only possible options. They're reasonable set of dates for this whole work of the apostle. They're close, but they're clearly not absolute. And so I wouldn't even begin to say that they were. Because regardless, the point remains the same. Paul's authority and message came directly from God. His apostleship was from God. He was preaching God's gospel. And that means this, and this is my point. This is really what I was getting to through all of this discussion. When Paul speaks, you and I, must accept his words for what they are, communication from God. Words to be heard and understood and obeyed. Don't let anybody say otherwise. Don't let anybody tell you don't have to obey the gospel. That obeying the gospel is the same thing as the works salvation that Paul was rebuking here in Galatians. No. Obedience is necessary. Without it, we have no connection to God. Paul's not saying don't obey. Paul's saying don't think you can earn your salvation. That was all he's saying. And especially he's doing that in the context of fighting Judaism and the Judaizing teachers. Paul may not have stayed in one place for very long. But we should be glad for that because his work, the gospel message, went throughout the world, even to your ears today. Which brings us to the last question. Are you listening? Are you listening? And will you obey? I hope you're listening, and I hope you'll obey. And if you are, and if you need more information, reach out to me at Facebook Messenger or by email at AmericanMissionaryBG@gmail.com. Reach out to me. Contact me. I'll be happy to study with you. I'll be happy to put you in touch with a local congregation of God's people, a local church of Christ, a church that belongs to Christ in your area, if there is one, and help you listen to the message that came from God through the Apostle Paul and is relayed to you and me in the written record of the New Testament. It's available. The only real question is, will you listen? I hope you will. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll come back next time as we continue our study of Paul's post-conversion life as proof of God being the source of his authority and his message. And we're going to look at, in particular, at the Jerusalem Conference in Acts chapter 15. I look forward to seeing you then. Until then, I'm James McClenny, praying that your heart will be filled with the glory of God.